September 13th, 2005, Blizzard releases a new raid zone in World of Warcraft called Zul'Gurub. The final boss, Hakar the Soul Flayer, has an ability called Corrupted Blood. It drains health and the debuff spreads between players who are in close proximity. Now, initially it was designed to stay inside of the raid, except at some points a player recalled their pet mid-raid, and this would end up exposing an error of the game developers, because the pet that was recalled was carrying the infection, and they brought it back into the open world. Within hours, the corrupted blood was everywhere. Cities like Ironforge and Stormwind, major hubs that were always packed with players, began to fill up with people taking damage, red all over the place, and everyone just dying all over the world of Warcraft. NPCs caught it too. Unlike players, they couldn't die from it, so they just became walking spreaders, endlessly passing to anybody who got too close. Over 4 million virtual characters were infected. It was a pandemic. And after about a month of chaos, Blizzard finally implemented a patch that made player pets and familiars immune to the infection, while rolling server restarts to flush out the remaining contagion. It took 4 weeks to get it under control in a video game. And yet, from this catastrophe, something interesting happened. An epidemiologist named Nina Pfefferman witnessed this outbreak unfold and closely studied this incident. As she watched what was happening in the world of Warcraft, she recognized something. The way that players were reacting in-game mirrored what she knew from studying human reactions to real-world outbreaks. So, she and her colleague Eric Lofgren wrote a paper about it in 2007. And so what they ended up finding out was that the behaviors players showed, such as avoidance, risk-taking, altruism, deliberate spreading of the disease, and failed quarantines, matched documented human responses to actual disease events in real life with an accuracy that surprised even them. Some players tried to quarantine, isolating themselves, which is a bit funny because that is what my wife and I did back in 2020. We stayed in our house and we didn't go outside. But continuing in WoW, some players cordoned off areas, warned people to stay back, and tried to set up safe zones. Others would completely ignore the warnings and run through infected areas anyway, either out of curiosity or because they just wanted to see what would happen. But a few deliberately sought out the disease and tried to carry it into crowds. And there were also people who stayed behind to help infected players, even though it meant getting infected themselves. Pfefferman saw the full range of behaviors from the real world happening inside of the game. We have this hardwired, ancient neurological instinct that kicks in before our brain even has time to process what's going on. And if this is true in a game where the stakes are just a character's health bar, imagine just what that might look like when the threat is real. The year is 1347. A ship docks in Sicily. The sailors on board are either dead or covered in black swelling masses, severely weakened and coughing up blood. And so the port officials send them back out to sea immediately. But while their ships drifted aimlessly out in the ocean, the disease didn't. Because within 5 years, somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population was gone. Constant resurgences of the bubonic plague going well into the 1600s. Now, medically, we understand today what the Black Death was. It was a disease carried by fleas that lived on rats and other small rodents. But the response will tell you everything about how people handle something that they can't explain. So, the first human instinct was to find a cause. It was going to be more than something biological. It was a moral cause. People were looking for a reason. Because if there was a reason, there was something that you could do about it, or you could have somebody to blame. So you got flagellant groups marching through towns, whipping themselves in public penance, believing that personal sin had brought this upon everyone. There was mass scapegoating. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells, and as a result, they were unjustly slaughtered in the thousands. And to make matters even worse, there were people running from cities unknowingly carrying the disease with them to the places that they ran to. But you also got the opposite. Communities that sealed themselves off completely, refused all contact with the outside world, and they survived as a result. That worked. But it had to take a level of collective discipline that is genuinely rare for people. The dominant mode was fear so great, it was all everyone knew. When something that invisible kills that many people, the human brain searches desperately for logic to hang on to, and if it can't find a real one, it will invent one. Jump forward to 1918. The First World War was raging, and I mention this because it shaped everything about how the Spanish flu was handled, or rather how it wasn't. You see, at first, governments suppressed news of the sickness across multiple countries. The reasoning was wartime morale. You couldn't have people panicking while soldiers were still fighting the Great War, and because of their decision to withhold this information from the general public, the disease ended up spreading through populations who largely didn't know what was coming. And Spain, unfortunately, became associated with it, even though the disease neither originated there, nor was the epidemic as prevalent there as elsewhere. And this was due to the fact that Spain was the only country whose press remained neutral in World War I, and so it ran the stories, becoming the primary source of the news about the disease. As a result of this, the disease became known as the Spanish flu, a branding problem Spain never asked for. But by the time the second wave of the Spanish flu hit in the autumn of 1918, it was significantly more deadly than the first. Young adults, in particular, a demographic that the flu typically spares, were dying at unusual rates. No one had a clear explanation for this. Some postulated that it was a combination of a deadlier strain, a depleted public health infrastructure, and an exhausted population. At this time, in Philadelphia, a city parade was planned, and it continued. I repeat, they were aware of the pandemic, and the city still chose not to cancel this parade. Within days, hospitals were full. Now let's go ahead and take a look at another city in another state, St. Louis. The city's health commissioner, Max Starkloff, canceled all public gatherings almost immediately upon hearing about the dire flu. Thanks to this, the death rate in St. Louis was a fraction of Philadelphia's. So we see how it was the same disease in the same country, but the cities had completely different outcomes based on one thing: how quickly the people in charge were willing to believe what they were seeing and act on it. What's interesting about the Spanish flu is how much social pressure drove individual behavior. People who were sick were afraid to say so because of the stigma. People who believed the disease was serious were told not to worry by officials who should have known better. Misinformation even came from the newspapers, from governments, from doctors who they themselves were uncertain about what was going on, but they tried to downplay the severity of the Spanish flu. Naturally, trust in authority began to fray, and when trust is broken, people start to improvise. And when people start to improvise with contagious diseases, well, you know where that ends up. COVID-19, coronavirus, the Rona, you lived through this one. But I want to bring your mind back to something. Do you remember when it started? Because I remember the first time I heard about it, I was at the barbershop. But it was during that very early stretch where nobody was quite sure how serious it was. I remember talking to my barber and thinking it honestly wasn't going to be a big thing, that it would blow over and that my wife and I could still go to Disneyland. Retrospect is 2020. I was wrong. Many of us were wrong. It got real. Things started to get serious. Lockdown happened. People's behaviors were chaotic. Supermarkets cleared out of toilet paper within days as if toilet paper was medically relevant. Seriously, people literally throwing hands over toilet paper. But in hindsight, when you stop to think about it, we can surmise that people were doing this just because somebody else was trying to buy it. After all, true to human nature, if everyone around you is frantically grabbing something from a shelf, your brain will psychologically read that as a signal, even when your logic tells you it doesn't make sense. However, then came the conflicting information. One day, the American government would say one thing, then the European government would say another thing, and then the Chinese, where it originally began, would say something different. And this was the case across the world. Scientists disagreeing publicly, public health experts arguing on social media, humans looking for something, someone to blame. In this case, a lot of Asian hate started to spread. Even if you weren't Chinese, if you looked Asian enough, you'd get the hate. And apparently now it's trendy to be Asian, so, you know? And things got worse before they got better. There was more skepticism, conspiracy theories, entrenched camps with completely irreconcilable beliefs. Beliefs from people who did not feel in control, so they tried to create control. And the internet made that goal feasible. It made the process faster, because if you had a phone, you could make a post, a tweet, or a video about your opinion and create echo chambers from there. But it wasn't all bad. There were many humans who were altruistic, well, as much as one could be. You had neighbors checking in on each other, mutual aid networks forming in days, healthcare, public service workers putting themselves in harm's way consistently for months without a break. Shout out to those who risked getting sick and bringing the Rona back to their own homes, to their own families, by the way. So, what is it? What is the thing that keeps producing identical patterns across 1,000 years of human history? A few things, actually, running at the same time. When certainty disappears, people start to copy one another. Innately, humans have evolved doing what other humans do because that's what they know works, even when it doesn't. If you don't know what the right move is, watching what other people do is a sensible shortcut. The problem is that when everybody is doing it simultaneously, you end up with a crowd making collective decisions that none of them individually would have made, and sometimes it ends up being a horrible thing. Racism was a huge byproduct of this, whether it was the Jewish community in the 1300s or the Chinese/Asian people in general in the 2000s. But fear also does something to a person's perception, because when you're scared, you tend to overestimate threats in one direction and also dismiss them in another, depending on how you're wired and who you're listening to. By the way, politicians know this. They know this about human psychology, and so they use that to distract you from one thing to another. Some people catastrophize, some people, like me, deny. However, both are the same coping mechanism, just going in opposite directions. But there is another thing I want to hit on. Emotional contagion, which could be even far more damaging than the sickness itself. Panic spreads faster than information, always has, always will. Because we are wired to sync with the emotional states of the people around us. It's how communities function, how humans connect and stay connected. It's a survival mechanism, but it's also how sometimes we come undone. The gap between a medieval peasant watching his neighbor die of something nobody understood and a person in a lockdown flat watching case numbers tick upward on a screen is enormous in terms of medicine, infrastructure, and knowledge. Like, it's a huge gap across time, and yet it is still very close in terms of human psychology. Health crises expose human behavior, and that means the next time a pandemic rolls around, we already know what's going to happen because we've seen it happen before. We just keep forgetting we have. God, I love history, and I love my wife.